The lecture hall was buzzing with the usual Monday morning energy. Students chatted quietly, flipping through notebooks and sipping coffee as they waited for class to begin. At exactly 9 o'clock, Professor Whitmore strode to the front of the room with the confidence of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. He was in his mid-50s, wearing his signature tweed jacket with elbow patches, and carried himself like he owned the place. Which in a way he did. 20 years of teaching at Grandview University had earned him tenure, respect, and a reputation that made freshmen nervous on the first day of class. Professor Whitmore didn't believe in easing students into the semester. He started every class with rapid-fire questions, calling on random students to see who had done the reading. Some professors were there to nurture and encourage. Whitmore saw himself as someone who separated the serious students from the lazy ones. At least that's what he told himself. Others had different words for his teaching style. Words like harsh, intimidating, mean-spirited even. The professor was 15 minutes into his lecture on the civil rights movement when the door at the back of the hall creaked open. Every head turned to watch a young black student slip inside, trying his best to be invisible. The student's name was Devin, and he was clearly flustered. His backpack was sliding off one shoulder, and he clutched a coffee cup that looked like it had been grabbed in a hurry. Professor Whitmore stopped mid-sentence. The room went silent. You could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights above. "How kind of you to join us," the professor said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Devin froze halfway down the aisle. He looked up, meeting the professor's eyes. "I'm really sorry, Professor. The campus shuttle broke down and I had to walk from the East dorms." It was a reasonable explanation. The East dorms were nearly a mile away, and the shuttle system at Grandview had been having problems all semester. Most professors would have nodded and moved on, but Whitmore wasn't most professors. "The shuttle broke down," he repeated slowly, like he was testing the words for truth. "Tell me something. In your community, is punctuality considered important, or is this just how things are done where you're from?" A few students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Devin's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "I apologize for being late, sir. It won't happen again." He tried to move to his seat, but Whitmore wasn't finished. No, please. Since you've interrupted my lecture on the civil rights movement, perhaps you can contribute something educational. I want you to prepare a presentation for Wednesday's class. 10 minutes on the cultural factors that contribute to, let's say, differing attitudes toward timeliness in various communities. The assignment landed like a slap. A few students in the back exchanged glances. One girl looked down at her desk, her face red with second-hand embarrassment. A couple of guys smirked, the kind of people who found this entertaining. Devin stood there for a moment, his face unreadable. "Yes, sir," he said quietly. Then he walked to an empty seat in the middle row and sat down, placing his backpack carefully beside him. Professor Whitmore returned to his lecture as if nothing had happened. He clicked to the next slide and began discussing the Montgomery bus boycott, completely missing the irony. Devin pulled out his laptop and began taking notes like every other student in the room. His face showed nothing. No anger, no shame. Just focus. But inside, Devin was processing what had just happened. This wasn't his first encounter with someone like Whitmore. Growing up, he'd learned to recognize the tone, the assumptions, the barely concealed prejudice wrapped in polite language. His grandmother had prepared him for moments like this. She'd sat him down before he left for college and told him the truth about the world he was entering. "Baby, you're going to meet people who think they're better than you," she had said, holding his hands in hers. "People who will look at you and make up their mind before you even open your mouth. You can't control what they think. But you can control what you show them, make them see who you really are through what you do, not by arguing about what they believe." Devin had nodded, but sitting in his grandmother's living room, it had seemed like abstract advice. Now, sitting in this lecture hall with every eye having watched his humiliation, it felt very concrete. What Professor Whitmore didn't know, what he couldn't have known from looking at Devin's enrollment records, was exactly who he had just challenged. Devin wasn't just any freshman stumbling into his first college history class. He was the reigning national debate champion. Last spring, he had stood on a stage in front of 2,000 people and demolished opponents from schools with debate programs that had million-dollar budgets. He'd received scholarship offers from Harvard, Yale, and Stanford, full rides to any of them. But Devin had chosen Grandview instead. The reason was simple and had nothing to do with prestige. His grandmother was sick, really sick. The doctors had given her maybe 2 years, probably less. She had raised Devin after his parents died in a car accident when he was 7. She was the only family he had left. So when it came time to choose a college, Devin picked the one 40 minutes from her house, close enough that he could visit every weekend. Close enough that when she needed him, he could be there. The debate trophies were packed away in boxes in her attic. Devin hadn't told anyone at Grandview about them. He wasn't here to show off or prove anything to anyone. He was here to get an education and be near his grandmother while he still could. As Professor Whitmore droned on about historical voting rights legislation, Devin continued taking notes. His handwriting was neat and precise. He wrote down every major point, every date, every name, not because the lecture was particularly good, but because that's what serious students did. That's what his grandmother had taught him. When class ended, students packed up their bags and filed out. A few glanced at Devin as they passed, some with sympathy, others with curiosity. Devin took his time organizing his notes and sliding his laptop into his backpack. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't hiding. He was just another student heading to his next class. But as he walked out into the bright autumn sunshine, Devin made a decision. He would do exactly what Professor Whitmore had asked. He would prepare that presentation. And he would do it so well with so much research and thought and care that no one in that room could question whether he belonged there. Devin didn't know it yet, but that presentation would be just the beginning. 2 weeks had passed since that first uncomfortable day in Professor Whitmore's class, and Devin had learned something important. That Monday morning hadn't been a one-time thing. It was a pattern. Every class session seemed to bring a new moment where the professor would single him out. It was never quite obvious enough that Devin could point to it and say definitively, "This is discrimination." Whitmore was too smart for that. Too experienced. But it was there, constant and wearing, like water dripping on stone. When they discussed the Constitutional Convention, Devin raised his hand to answer a question about the 3/5 compromise. He'd done the reading carefully, highlighting the relevant passages and taking notes. But when he explained how the compromise affected representation in Congress, Professor Whitmore cut him off mid-sentence. "That's a very simplified interpretation," the professor said, dismissing Devin's answer with a wave of his hand. He then called on another student, a guy named Brett who sat in the front row, and praised his answer even though Brett said essentially the same thing Devin had, just using slightly different words. During a discussion about World War II, Devin cited a book by a respected historian he'd found in the library. Professor Whitmore frowned and said, "I'm not familiar with that source." "Are you sure it's academically rigorous? Sometimes popular history books can be misleading." The book Devin had cited was published by Oxford University Press and written by a professor who had won multiple awards. Devin knew this because he'd checked. He always checked. But he didn't argue. He just nodded and wrote down the professor's comment. The real problem came when Devin submitted his first major paper. The assignment was to write about an innovation or invention that changed American society. Devin chose to write about the traffic light, specifically focusing on Garrett Morgan, the black inventor who created the 3-position traffic signal in the 1920s. He spent hours in the library, reading patent documents, newspaper articles from that era, and academic journals about the history of transportation safety. His paper was 12 pages long, properly formatted, with 23 citations from credible sources. He made sure every fact was backed up, every claim supported by evidence. Devin had learned in debate competitions that the strength of your argument was only as good as your sources. He turned it in feeling confident. When he got it back a week later, there was a C- written in red pen at the top. Devin stared at the grade for a long moment, convinced there must be some mistake. He flipped through the pages, looking for comments, for explanation. There were a few vague notes in the margins. Needs more analysis. Citation format inconsistent. Lacks academic rigor. Devin looked at the citation format note and felt his stomach sink. He had used Chicago style, exactly as the assignment instructions specified. He pulled up the original assignment on his laptop right there in class and checked. Yes, Chicago style, just like he'd done. That afternoon, he went to Professor Whitmore's office hours. The professor was eating a sandwich at his desk, reading something on his computer. He looked up when Devin knocked on the open door. "Yes? Professor Whitmore, I wanted to ask about my paper. I'm confused about some of the feedback." The professor sighed like Devin was interrupting something important. "What's confusing?" "The grade reflects the quality of the work." Devin stepped into the office holding his paper. "You marked down my citations as inconsistent, but I used Chicago style throughout like the assignment required. And I'm not sure what you mean by lax academic rigor. I cited peer-reviewed journals and primary sources." Whitmore barely glanced at the paper. The overall argument was weak. "You chose a relatively minor historical figure and tried to inflate his importance. It felt more like an identity politics exercise than serious historical analysis." The words hit Devin like a physical blow, but he kept his face neutral. Garrett Morgan's invention is still used worldwide today. Multiple historians have written about his contributions to urban safety. "Perhaps in popular history," the professor said dismissively. "Look, I appreciate that you want to highlight certain figures, but this is a rigorous academic course. I need to see analysis that goes beyond surface-level diversity narratives." Devin left the office without another word. As he walked across campus back to his dorm, he pulled up his phone and texted his roommate, asking what grade he'd gotten on his paper. His roommate Tyler wrote back immediately, "B+. Pretty happy with it, you?" Devin didn't respond. When he got back to their room, Tyler was at his desk and Devin asked to see his paper. Tyler handed it over, looking slightly confused. Devin read through it quickly. It was 8 pages long, 15 citations. The topic was the cotton gin, which was fine, but the analysis was pretty basic. Nothing wrong with it, but nothing particularly deep either. There were a few grammar mistakes that the professor hadn't marked. Tyler had gotten a B+. Devin had gotten a C-. That evening, Devin sat on his bed with his laptop, staring at the grade recorded in the online portal. He thought about emailing the department chair. He thought about filing a formal complaint. But he also knew how these things usually went. Whitmore had tenure. He'd been there for 20 years. Devin was a first-semester freshman. Who would they believe? The next day in class, something else happened that made Devin realize he wasn't imagining things. A girl named Kelly, who sat 2 rows behind him, approached him after the lecture ended. She had red hair and freckles and always seemed nervous when she spoke up in class. "Hey," she said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. "I just wanted to say, I've noticed how Professor Whitmore treats you." "It's not okay," Devin was surprised. He'd thought he was hiding his frustration pretty well. "What do you mean?" Kelly shifted her weight from one foot to the other. "The way he dismisses your comments. How he questions your sources but not other people's. I'm a sophomore and I had him last year too. There was a student then, a guy from Nigeria, and Whitmore did the same thing to him. The guy ended up dropping the class. Did he ever report it?" "He tried," Kelly said. "He went to the department chair. But Whitmore's been here forever and he's got friends in the administration. They said it was just a difference in academic standards and teaching styles. Nothing happened." After Kelly left, Devin sat alone in the lecture hall for a few minutes. The cleaning staff was starting to work their way through the building, emptying trash cans and wiping down desks. He thought about what his grandmother would say. She'd probably tell him to keep his head down, do his best, and not let one professor define his college experience. But another part of Devin, the part that had stood on debate stages and defended positions against people who tried to tear him down, was getting tired of staying quiet. He hadn't come to college to be invisible. He hadn't earned his way here just to be treated like he didn't belong. Over the next week, Devin watched more carefully. He paid attention to how Professor Whitmore interacted with different students. The pattern became impossible to ignore. White students, especially the guys who sat in the front and laughed at the professor's jokes, got friendly treatment. Their questions were called insightful. Their papers came back with encouraging comments and good grades. But Devin wasn't the only one being treated differently. There was a girl from South Korea who spoke with an accent. Whitmore often asked her to repeat herself, then would rephrase her comments in a way that sounded condescending. There was another black student, a quiet guy who usually sat in the back. When he answered a question correctly, Whitmore would say things like surprisingly accurate or better than expected. Devin started keeping notes. Not for any official purpose, just to have a record. Dates, comments, grades, the way certain students were treated versus others. He told himself he probably wouldn't do anything with the information. but having it written down made him feel less crazy, less like he was imagining the whole thing. Then came the class where everything changed. They were discussing the Founding Fathers, specifically Thomas Jefferson. Professor Whitmore was in rare form that day, pacing at the front of the room with energy, talking about Jefferson's brilliance, his vision for democracy, his contributions to American political thought. "We have to understand these men in the context of their time," Whitmore said. "Yes, many of them owned slaves. But that was simply how society functioned then. It doesn't diminish their intellectual achievements or their importance to our nation's founding." Devon's hand went up. He didn't plan it. It just happened. Professor Whitmore saw Devon's hand go up and paused mid-stride. For just a second, something flickered across his face. Annoyance, maybe. Or perhaps he was calculating whether to call on Devon at all. But there were too many other students watching, waiting. Ignoring a raised hand would be too obvious, yes? The professor said, his tone already defensive. Devon stood up slowly. His grandmother had taught him that standing when you speak commands respect. It was old-fashioned maybe, but it worked. Every eye in the lecture hall turned toward him. "I understand the importance of historical context," Devon began, keeping his voice level and respectful. "But I think there's a difference between understanding the time period and using it to excuse moral failures." Jefferson himself wrote about slavery being wrong. In his notes on Virginia, he called it a moral depravity. He knew it was wrong, but he kept doing it anyway because it benefited him economically. A few students nodded. Others looked uncomfortable. Professor Whitmore's expression hardened. "That's a very simplistic reading of a complex historical figure," he said. "You're applying modern moral standards to the 18th century. That's exactly the kind of anachronistic thinking that leads to bad history." Devon didn't sit down. "But we're not talking about some unknown moral standard that hadn't been invented yet. There were abolitionists in Jefferson's own time, Quakers who refused to own slaves on moral grounds. Benjamin Franklin freed his slaves and became an abolitionist. So clearly, some people in that era understood that slavery was wrong. Jefferson wrote beautifully about freedom and human rights while owning over 600 people during his lifetime. That contradiction seems worth examining, not explaining away. The room was dead silent now. This wasn't just a student asking a clarifying question. This was a challenge, and everyone could feel it. Professor Whitmore's face was turning red. He set down the marker he'd been holding and crossed his arms. "I've been teaching this period for 2 decades. I think I understand the nuances better than someone who's been in college for a month. Your perspective, while enthusiastic, lacks the depth of serious historical scholarship. It was a power move, a reminder of who had the credentials, who held the authority in this room. Most students would have backed down, apologized, sat down and stayed quiet for the rest of the semester." Devon remained standing. "I'm not questioning your expertise, Professor. I'm questioning the conclusion. If we teach that the Founding Fathers' slaveholding was just a product of their time, we're ignoring the voices of enslaved people who certainly didn't think it was acceptable. We're ignoring the white abolitionists who fought against it. We're creating a narrative where the most powerful people get a pass, and the people who objected don't get included in the story." A girl in the third row actually gasped. Tyler, Devon's roommate who was also in the class, had his phone out under his desk, clearly recording. Kelly, the red-haired student who had approached Devon earlier, was leaning forward in her seat, completely focused. Professor Whitmore walked toward Devon's row. It felt almost aggressive the way he closed the distance. "You seem very confident in your opinions. Perhaps you'd like to teach the class yourself." It was meant to be dismissive, sarcastic, a way to make Devon look foolish and put him back in his place. But Devon heard something else in the challenge. An opportunity. "I'm happy to present research on this topic if you think it would benefit the class," Devon said calmly. The professor laughed, but it wasn't a friendly sound. "Research, I see. Tell you what, since you're so convinced that your interpretation is correct and mine is wrong, let's make this educational for everyone. Next Wednesday we'll have a formal debate. You can present your revisionist take on the Founding Fathers, and I'll present the actual historical consensus. How does that sound?" He was calling Devon's bluff. The expectation was clear. Devon would back down, mumble something about not wanting to take up class time, and sink back into his seat humiliated. Professors didn't debate students. The power dynamic made it absurd. It would be like a chess grandmaster challenging a kid who just learned how the pieces move. Devin looked Professor Whitmore directly in the eye. I accept. The professor blinked. What? I accept your challenge. Next Wednesday we'll debate the topic formally. I'm looking forward to it. For a moment, Professor Whitmore seemed genuinely thrown off balance. Then his expression shifted into something almost predatory. A smile spread across his face. Excellent. We'll use a standard debate format. 20 minutes each for opening arguments, then 10 minutes for rebuttals. I'll notify the department. This should be quite educational. He turned back to the front of the room and Devin sat down. His heart was hammering in his chest, but his hands were steady. Around him, students were whispering to each other, pulling out their phones, texting frantically. The news was already spreading. After class, Devin was swarmed. Tyler grabbed his shoulder the moment they got outside. Dude, are you insane? You just challenged a professor to a debate. He's going to destroy you. Kelly pushed through the small crowd. That was either the bravest or the stupidest thing I've ever seen in a classroom. Devin just smiled and said he needed to get to his next class. But inside, his mind was already working. This wasn't his first debate, not even close. It was just the first one that really mattered. By the time Devin got back to his dorm room that afternoon, his phone was blowing up. Somehow word had spread beyond just his history class. People he didn't even know were texting him, asking if it was true that he'd challenged Professor Whitmore. Someone had already created a Facebook event for the debate. Over 300 people had marked themselves as interested in less than 2 hours. Devin sat on his bed and took a deep breath. Then he opened his laptop and started making a list. He had 7 days to prepare. 7 days to build an argument strong enough to stand up against someone with a PhD and 20 years of teaching experience. 7 days to prove that he deserved to be taken seriously. But he also knew he needed help. Real help. Devin pulled up the university directory and found what he was looking for. Professor Janet Rodriguez, Communication Department, Debate Team Faculty Advisor. He sent her an email explaining the situation and asking if she had time to meet. Then he headed to the library. The next morning, Devin woke up to a response from Professor Rodriguez. She wanted to meet that afternoon in her office. When Devin arrived, she was waiting with a concerned expression. I heard about what happened, she said, gesturing for him to sit down. Actually, half the campus has heard about it. Do you understand what you've gotten yourself into? Devin nodded. I think so. No, I don't think you do. Professor Rodriguez leaned forward. Malcolm Whitmore has an ego the size of this building. He doesn't just want to win this debate. He wants to humiliate you. He wants to make an example out of you so no other student ever challenges him again, and he has every advantage. He's older, more experienced, more credentialed. He controls your grade. The power dynamic here is completely skewed. I know, Devin said quietly, but I couldn't just sit there and let it go. Not anymore. Professor Rodriguez studied him for a long moment. Then she asked a question that surprised him. Have you ever done competitive debate before? Devin hesitated. He hadn't told anyone at Grandview about his debate background. It felt like bragging, and he'd wanted to just be a regular student. But now, sitting in this office, he realized that staying quiet about it wasn't helping anyone. Yeah, he said. I was on my high school team. Just high school? Devin took a breath. I was the national champion last year. Individual division. I also helped my team win the national team championship my junior year. Professor Rodriguez's eyebrows shot up. National champion. And you came to Grandview instead of... Harvard offered me a full ride for their debate program. So did Yale. But I needed to stay close to home. My grandmother's sick. The professor sat back in her chair, a slow smile spreading across her face. Malcolm Whitmore has no idea who he just challenged, does he? No, ma'am. Good. She pulled out a notepad. Then let's make sure he never makes that mistake again. We have 7 days. Tell me everything you know about this topic, and let's figure out how to build your case. They worked for 3 hours that first day. Professor Rodriguez was tough, asking hard questions, poking holes in Devin's arguments, making him defend every point. But she also taught him things he hadn't considered. How to use silence for emphasis. How to address your opponent with respect while dismantling their logic. How to turn their own words against them without seeming aggressive. Over the next week, Devin barely slept. He spent every free moment in the library, reading everything he could find. Letters written by enslaved people. Economic records showing how slavery shaped early American wealth. Writings from 18th century abolitionists. Jefferson's own correspondence where he wrestled with the contradiction between his ideals and his actions. He also watched videos of Professor Whitmore's previous lectures, studying his style. The man was good, charismatic. He knew how to work a room, how to make people laugh, how to sound authoritative. Devin would need to be better than good. He would need to be flawless. 3 days before the debate, Devin drove out to visit his grandmother. She was having a good day, sitting up in bed, her eyes bright despite how thin she'd gotten. He told her everything that had happened. She listened quietly, holding his hand. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Baby, are you doing this for the right reasons? Because if you're just trying to prove something, that's ego. But if you're doing it because it needs to be done, because someone needs to speak up, then that's different." Devin thought about it. Both maybe, but mostly because if I don't do this, he's going to keep treating students like me the same way, and they might not have the tools to fight back. His grandmother squeezed his hand. "Then you go show them what you're made of." Wednesday morning arrived with unusual weather for October. Dark clouds hung over campus, and there was electricity in the air that had nothing to do with the coming storm. By the time Devin walked toward the lecture hall at 8:30, his phone had buzzed with at least 50 messages from people wishing him luck or asking if they could attend. The debate was scheduled for the regular class time, 9 o'clock. But when Devin arrived 15 minutes early, the lecture hall was already completely full. Students packed every seat. More stood along the walls and sat in the aisles. Devin recognized faces from across campus, people he'd never met, all crowding in to watch. He also noticed something that made his stomach clench. Several faculty members were scattered throughout the room, some he recognized from orientation, others he'd never seen before. They sat with notebooks, watching everything with careful academic interest. This wasn't just a classroom debate anymore. It had become an event. Tyler found Devin near the door. "Dude, there are people outside who couldn't get in. Campus security is here making sure the fire code doesn't get violated." "This is insane." Kelly pushed through the crowd. "I saved you a seat near the front, but I think Professor Whitmore wants you up at the podium area." Devin nodded and made his way forward. His messenger bag felt heavy with note cards and printed sources. He'd practiced his opening statement so many times that he could recite it in his sleep. But standing here now, looking at all these faces, feeling the weight of expectations, his mouth felt dry. Professor Whitmore entered from the side door at exactly 9 o'clock. He'd dressed up for the occasion, wearing a full suit instead of his usual tweed jacket. He carried a leather folder and walked to the podium with the confidence of someone who'd given 1,000 lectures. He surveyed the packed room and smiled. "Well," he said into the microphone, his voice booming through the speakers, "it seems we've attracted quite an audience. Welcome, everyone. Today we'll be having what I hope will be an educational discussion about historical interpretation and the importance of rigorous academic standards." The way he said educational made it clear that he expected this to be a lesson in humility for Devin. Several students in the front row laughed. Whitmore's usual supporters, Devin noticed. The ones who always agreed with him, who laughed at his jokes, who got good grades. Devin walked to the podium when Whitmore gestured him forward. They stood on opposite sides of the front of the room, like opposing lawyers in a courtroom. A teaching assistant Devin had never met before sat at a desk between them with a timer. "The format is simple," Professor Whitmore explained to the crowd. "We'll each have 20 minutes for our opening argument, then 10 minutes for rebuttal. I'll go first. As is traditional for the affirmative position, the topic is framed by our young challenger here, is whether we should view the Founding Fathers' participation in slavery as a moral failing that affects how we interpret their contributions to American democracy." He made it sound almost ridiculous, phrasing it that way, like Devin was some kind of radical trying to tear down historical figures for fun. Devin kept his face neutral, but he made a mental note. Whitmore was already trying to frame the narrative, to make Devin seem like the unreasonable one. The teaching assistant clicked the timer. "Professor Whitmore, you have 20 minutes. What happened next was impressive, Devin had to admit. Professor Whitmore was a master of his craft. He started with a joke that got the room laughing. Then he shifted into his lecture mode, that confident, engaging style that had probably won over thousands of students over the years. He talked about the complexity of the 18th century, about how different the world was then. He explained the economic structures that made slavery seem inevitable to people of that era. He quoted several respected historians who emphasized the need for contextual understanding. He spoke passionately about Jefferson's contributions to democracy, about the Declaration of Independence, about the vision of human rights that inspired people around the world. "We cannot judge historical figures by modern standards," Whitmore said, pacing as he spoke, making eye contact with different sections of the crowd. "That's not history. That's presentism. It's intellectually lazy and historically dishonest." Thomas Jefferson was a man of his time, shaped by forces and assumptions that seem foreign to us now. But his ideas, his vision of human potential and democratic governance, those transcended his era. They changed the world. He paused for effect, looking directly at Devon. To reduce him to merely a slaveholder is to miss everything that made him significant. It's to let our contemporary moral comfort blind us to the actual complexity of the past, and that ultimately serves no one's understanding. It was a strong argument delivered beautifully. Several students were nodding. Even some of the faculty members looked impressed. When the timer buzzed and Whitmore finished, there was scattered applause. He walked back to his position with a satisfied smile. The teaching assistant looked at Devon. "You have 20 minutes." Devon stood and walked to the podium. He placed his note cards on the surface, then looked out at the sea of faces. Every eye in the room was on him. He could feel the weight of their expectations, their doubts, their curiosity. His heart was pounding, but his hands were steady. He began to speak. "Thank you, Professor Whitmore, for that presentation, and thank you all for being here today." His voice was calmer than he felt, projected clearly without shouting. Professor Rodriguez had taught him that. Control your breathing, control your voice, control the room. Professor Whitmore is right about one thing. Context matters. We need to understand the 18th century on its own terms. But context isn't the same as excuse. And understanding isn't the same as acceptance. So let me provide some context that I think is important to this discussion. Devon looked down at his first note card, then back up. He'd practiced this transition 100 times. In 1785, Thomas Jefferson wrote a letter to a friend where he described slavery as a moral evil that would eventually bring divine judgment on America. In his notes on the state of Virginia, he wrote detailed passages about how slavery degraded both the enslaved and the enslaver. He understood it was wrong. He said so repeatedly in his own words. Devon paused, letting that sink in. But in that same year, 1785, Jefferson owned 267 enslaved people. When he died in 1826, he had owned over 600 people during his lifetime. He freed only 5 of them in his will, and those 5 were all members of the Hemings family, the family of Sally Hemings, a woman he enslaved and with whom he had at least 6 children. The room had gone completely quiet. Devon could see some students shifting uncomfortably. This wasn't abstract historical debate anymore. These were real people he was talking about. Real lives. Professor Whitmore says we can't judge historical figures by modern standards, but I'm not using modern standards. I'm using the standards of people who lived in Jefferson's own time. Let me give you some examples. Devon pulled out a sheet with printed quotes. In 1688, more than a century before Jefferson was born, Quakers in Pennsylvania issued the first formal protest against slavery in the American colonies. In 1775, the Pennsylvania Abolition Society was founded. Benjamin Franklin, Jefferson's contemporary, became its president in 1787. Franklin had owned slaves earlier in his life, but he freed them and spent his final years actively fighting slavery. He looked up from his notes. John Adams, another founding father, never owned slaves. He called slavery a moral evil and refused to participate in it despite the economic advantages it might have brought him. So we're not talking about some universal 18th century blind spot. We're talking about choices. Jefferson knew slavery was wrong. Others around him were actively fighting against it. He chose to keep doing it anyway because it benefited him. Devon could see Professor Whitmore's face reddening, but he continued. Now let's talk about the enslaved people themselves. Did they think slavery was just a product of the times? In 1791, enslaved people in Haiti launched a revolution that overthrew slavery there. Throughout the American South, enslaved people resisted constantly. They ran away. They sabotaged work. They preserved their humanity and their dignity despite everything the system tried to do to them. He picked up another set of notes. There are thousands of slave narratives, written testimonies from people who survived slavery. Let me read you just one line. From a man named Henry Bibb who was born enslaved in 1815. He wrote, "I was born a slave, but I was not born to be a slave." The people who were enslaved didn't accept the moral framework that said their enslavement was okay. They knew it was evil. They said so. They wrote it down. Their voices exist in the historical record. Devon's voice grew stronger as he continued. So when we say we need to understand the Founding Fathers in context, whose context are we talking about? The context of wealthy white men who benefited from slavery, or the context of the hundreds of thousands of enslaved people who knew exactly what was being done to them? He could feel the room's energy shifting. People were leaning forward now, fully engaged. Professor Whitmore talked about Jefferson's contributions to democracy and human rights. And yes, those contributions were real and significant. The Declaration of Independence changed the world. But here's the thing about that document. It says all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with inalienable rights. Jefferson wrote those words while owning human beings. Devon's voice was passionate now, but still controlled. That's not just ironic. It's not just unfortunate. It's a fundamental contradiction that shaped everything about early American democracy. The United States was founded on two opposing ideas existing at the same time: freedom and slavery, equality and white supremacy. Jefferson lived that contradiction every single day. So did the people he enslaved. He paused, taking a breath. Professor Whitmore says that reducing Jefferson to merely a slaveholder misses his significance. But I'm not reducing him. I'm expanding our understanding of him. Jefferson was brilliant and accomplished. He was also a man who enslaved hundreds of people while writing about freedom. Both of those things are true. Both of those things matter. And examining that contradiction doesn't diminish our understanding of early America. It deepens it. Devon moved to his final point, aware that his 20 minutes were almost up. He looked out at the crowd, then directly at Professor Whitmore. "There's one more thing I want to address." Professor Whitmore said that judging historical figures by modern moral standards is intellectually lazy. But I think there's something else that's intellectually lazy, and that's pretending that the moral questions of the past don't connect to the present. That we can study slavery as just an abstract historical phenomenon, without thinking about how it shaped everything that came after: wealth inequality, racial discrimination, the achievement gap, mass incarceration. All of these things have roots in that original system that Jefferson participated in while writing about freedom. He could see several faculty members taking notes now. Kelly was recording on her phone. Tyler looked stunned. So yes, context matters. Understanding matters. But so does honesty. If we're going to teach history, we need to teach all of it. Not just the comfortable parts. Not just the parts that make America look good. We need to teach about the Founding Fathers' brilliance and their moral failures. About their vision for democracy and their participation in slavery. About the words they wrote and the lives they actually lived. That's not revisionism. That's just history. The timer buzzed. Devon had used exactly 20 minutes. He gathered his note cards and stepped back from the podium. For a moment, there was complete silence in the room. Then someone in the back started clapping. Then someone else. Within seconds, the entire lecture hall erupted in applause. Not everyone was clapping. Some students sat with their arms crossed, looking uncomfortable. A few of Whitmore's usual supporters looked angry, but most of the room was on their feet, applauding. Several faculty members were clapping too, including a woman Devon recognized as the department chair. Professor Whitmore stood at his position, his face ashen. The teaching assistant had to call for quiet twice before the room settled down enough for the rebuttal period to begin. Whitmore's rebuttal was nowhere near as strong as his opening statement. He seemed rattled, falling back on repeating points he'd already made. He accused Devon of being overly emotional, of letting contemporary political concerns cloud historical judgment. But the energy had shifted. The room wasn't with him anymore. When it was Devon's turn for rebuttal, he kept it simple. "Professor Whitmore keeps saying I'm applying modern moral standards. But I've spent most of my presentation using 18th century sources. Quaker abolitionists from the 1680s, Benjamin Franklin's writings from the 1780s, Jefferson's own words about slavery being evil, slave narratives from people who lived through it. These aren't modern perspectives. These are voices from that era that we've chosen not to emphasize in how we teach this period. The question isn't whether we're judging by modern standards. The question is whose voices from that time period we choose to listen to." He paused, then added one final point. "Professor Whitmore said earlier that teaching history the way I'm suggesting would serve no one's understanding. But I disagree. I think it serves the understanding of everyone who's been told that their ancestors' suffering was just the way things were back then. Everyone who's been taught that the people who profited from that suffering were just products of their time. Everyone who deserves to know the full truth of how this country was built and who paid the price for it. When Devin finished, the applause was even louder than before. Students were cheering. Tyler was shouting. Even some of the faculty members looked moved. Professor Whitmore just stood there silent, his carefully constructed authority crumbling around him. The teaching assistant declared the debate concluded. Professor Whitmore muttered something about class being dismissed and walked out of the lecture hall through the side door. He didn't look at Devin. He didn't look at anyone. The moment he was gone, Devin was surrounded. Students crowded around him, wanting to shake his hand, take photos, tell him how amazing that was. Kelly hugged him, tears in her eyes. That was incredible. Thank you. Several faculty members approached too. The department chair, a woman named Professor Anderson, waited patiently until the crowd thinned a bit. That was remarkable, she said quietly. Really remarkable. I'd like to talk with you about what happened in this class. Would you be willing to meet with me this week? Devin nodded, still processing everything that had just happened. Professor Rodriguez appeared from somewhere in the crowd, beaming. I knew you could do it. But even I didn't expect that. You were brilliant up there. Over the next few hours, Devin's phone became basically unusable. Messages poured in from everyone. Someone had recorded the entire debate and posted it on social media. Within an hour, it had 1,000 views. By that evening, it had 10,000. By the next morning, it had gone viral. The video spread across campus first, then to other universities, then beyond. News outlets picked it up. Education websites wrote articles about it. People were sharing it with captions like "Student Dismantles," "Professor's Defense of Founding," "Father's Slavery," and "This is what happens when you underestimate your students." The university administration could no longer ignore what had been happening in Professor Whitmore's class. The viral video put everything in the spotlight. Devin received an email from Professor Anderson asking him to come to her office as soon as possible. When he arrived the next day, she wasn't alone. The dean of students was there too, along with someone from the university's Title VI compliance office. They asked Devin to explain his experiences in the class, everything that had happened, the comments about punctuality and cultural differences, the disparate grading, the pattern of dismissive treatment. Devin told them everything. Kelly had already submitted a statement too, describing what she'd witnessed. Other students came forward. The guy from Nigeria who dropped the class last year heard about what happened and sent a detailed account of his experiences with Whitmore. The investigation moved quickly, driven by the public attention the viral video had generated. Within a week, the university announced that Professor Whitmore had been placed on administrative leave pending a full review of his conduct. They assigned a substitute professor to take over his classes for the remainder of the semester. The review took 3 weeks. Investigators interviewed dozens of students from Whitmore's classes over the past several years. They examined grade distributions and found clear patterns. Black students and international students received significantly lower grades than white students, even when their work quality was comparable. Comments on papers showed consistent bias. Students of color were held to different standards, their sources questioned, their arguments dismissed. The university released a statement saying they took these findings seriously and were implementing immediate reforms. Professor Whitmore was removed from teaching duties. He would not be returning to the classroom, though the details of his departure were kept private due to personnel policies. But the impact went beyond just one professor. The university announced the creation of a student advocacy board, specifically designed to review complaints about bias and discrimination in the classroom. They implemented mandatory training for all faculty on inclusive teaching practices. They created an anonymous reporting system so students could flag concerns without fear of retaliation. Devin received a personal apology from the dean and an offer to retake the class with a different professor if he wanted, with his previous grades expunged from his record. They also offered him a position as a peer tutor in the history department, which came with a small stipend. But perhaps more meaningful than any of that was the change Devin saw in his fellow students. People started speaking up more in classes when they noticed something that didn't seem right. They said something. The culture of just accepting whatever a professor said, of not questioning authority, started to shift. One afternoon, about a month after the debate, Devin was studying in the library when a young black student he didn't recognize approached his table nervously. "Are you Devin?" the student asked. "Yeah, that's me. I'm Chris. I'm a freshman, first semester like you. I just wanted to say thank you. I had a professor who kept mispronouncing my name even after I corrected him like 5 times. He made me feel like I didn't belong here. But after I saw your video, I went to his office and I told him firmly that he needed to learn to say my name correctly, and he apologized. Actually apologized. I don't think he would have done that if you hadn't shown us that it's okay to stand up for ourselves." Chris left and Devin sat there for a moment, thinking about what he'd said. That was the thing, Devin realized. The debate wasn't really about Thomas Jefferson or historical interpretation, not at its core. It was about respect, about being seen as fully human, about refusing to accept being diminished. That weekend, Devin drove out to visit his grandmother. She was having a bad day, too tired to sit up for long, but she insisted he tell her everything that had happened. He did, leaving nothing out. The debate, the viral video, the investigation, all of it. When he finished, she was quiet for a while. Then she reached for his hand. "Baby, do you remember what I told you before you left for college? About showing people who you are through what you do?" "Yes, ma'am. I was wrong about one thing. I told you not to argue, not to fight back, just to prove yourself through excellence. But what you did was both. You stood up for yourself and you showed your excellence at the same time. That took more courage than I ever had." Her eyes were wet. "Your parents would have been so proud of you. I'm so proud of you." Devin felt tears in his own eyes. "I was scared the whole time." "Good, that means you understood what was at stake." Courage isn't about not being scared. It's about being scared and doing the right thing anyway. They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, just holding hands. His grandmother dozed off eventually, and Devin stayed until the nurse came by for evening rounds. As he drove back to campus, he thought about everything that had changed in just a few weeks. The attention from the viral video was already starting to fade. Someone else's story would take over the social media cycle soon, but the changes at the university, those would last. The advocacy board, the training programs, the students who felt empowered to speak up. Those things mattered more than viral fame. Devin's phone buzzed with a text from Professor Rodriguez. She'd forwarded him an email from the coach of Harvard's debate team. They'd seen the video and wanted to know if Devin would consider transferring for spring semester. Full scholarship, full support.